I'm not a fan of legislation in general, but security and supply chain security at large is a market failure, no doubt, right? Because that will not be solved without legal pushbacks from the government bodies, right? There's no way.
If I operated a commercial company, I can clearly see that investments in cybersecurity didn't give me more market share or more margins because customers have no knowledge, they don't require it, but they require new cool features. So I focus on new features.
Welcome back to another episode of Nerding Out with Viktor. Today, I'm joined by Olle and Anthony, who are definitely big names in the European SBOM world. So welcome, Olle and Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, we've been running in the same circles quite a while right now. Olle, you are leading up the Transparent Exchange API, so I see your face every other week at least on the meetings there. And Anthony, anything that's SBOM related, I tend to see your name as well. So you guys are very, very much highly in the SBOM world. But for those not familiar with you guys, Olle, I'll let you start off with giving a quick introduction to yourself.
Well, I'm a gardener living in Sollentuna, Sweden, but in my spare time, I do a lot of stuff related to the Cyber Resilience Act and software transparency. I'm a member of CycloneDX, as you pointed out. We're working TC54 to standardize software transparency with SBOMs, the CycloneDX format, the CLE format, and many others. I'm also engaged in ORC VG on CRA-related issues and OpenSSF.
Good stuff. Thanks, Olle. Anthony, you want to give a quick pitch about what you're doing and who you are?
Yeah, okay. So I'm Anthony Harrison from the UK. So looking outside the EU and the regulations that are changing weekly, as we all got to talk about.
Yeah.
I've got a background in building complex systems, and now I run my own business, which is looking at the software supply chain and the software risk about developing software. And I write one or two open source software tools in the SBOM space, which seems to get some traction, which is always very nice.
Very cool. So it wasn't clear there's going to be an episode on SBOM. We've done more than we basically had anybody who's anything in the SBOM world, except, well, I can think of a few names that I still should get on there. But I have most people that are in the SBOM world have been on the podcast before. But this is essentially a follow-up to the episode I did with Sarah Flux on CRA. And the thesis for this episode and what I want to cover in this episode is really all things in the surrounding universe of CRA, right? Because CRA is a big thing, but CRA kind of talks about a lot of other things, and it's kind of it's one piece in a bigger puzzle. And there are, I mean, just to name a few, like there's NIS2, there is DORA. Where do you guys want to start to unpack this whole complex web of acronyms?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I have a history in open source and being a consultant. So when I started studying this, I realized that there was a few people in the EU saying that the EU is leading in regulation.
Yeah.
Surprised me. I didn't know there was a world championship going on. And I don't know.
There aren't that many contestants.
No, I haven't seen that. But it is a complex world, and the more time you spend on it, both the process within the EU, which is confusing when you start. I followed the CRA through all the hoops and mistakes until it became an active act, to say. But as you say, the whole regulation landscape can be confusing. There are so much happening. And there's an organization called Open Forum Europe that tries to follow this and inform us in the open source world, because we haven't really paid much attention until the CRA.
No.
When the first proposal of CRA came, we realized that we had to engage. And the Commission were a bit surprised because we came late into the game. All the other major players had lobbyists in Brussels. Open source, we didn't have the money, we didn't have the people. But we changed that by working together, and I think that's amazing. But that also means that we're constantly now looking into the regulation landscape. And I can't say I follow all the details, but there is a lot of things happening.
Yeah.
And I think we can sort of see, the US started taking an interest, shall we say, back 2020, 2021, because of things like solar winds. And obviously, because of where solar winds hit, then people started realizing software and systems are very complex, it's very intertwined, and that transparency wasn't visible. And then when you now start looking at, our critical systems that we have in many countries, our utilities, our finance systems, etc., any one of those, any weaknesses in any one of those could have, catastrophic effects on society. So actually having that greater visibility is desirable for everybody to manage that risk.
Yeah, I mean,
going back, I would say that much of this work started with Log4j and SolarWinds. When I do trainings, when I do talks, I quite often start with Log4j and the cost for society to find out if we had Log4j in our systems. Not mitigation, not cost for the cybercrime caused by this bug, but the cost of finding out. I mean, I myself was called into the office on a Sunday to go through systems and check for this. A consultant on a Sunday, that's not cheap business. And we were many consultants and employees in the office. And the number of mail we got being engaged as open source developers from users, I mean, the cost of that was too high. But going back to the starting point for CRA, the Commission says the cost for society for all these cybercrimes is way too high. And it's time to fix this. And the open free market can't fix this by itself.
I think
that's obvious.
I think that's so important to stress. Because I think, to me, and I've said this on previous episodes, right? I'm not a fan of legislation in general. But security and supply chain security at large is a market failure. No doubt, right? Because that will not be solved without legal pushbacks from the government bodies, right? There's no way.
If I operated a commercial company, I can clearly see that investments in cybersecurity didn't give me more market share or more margins because customers have no knowledge, they don't require it, but they require new cool features. So I focus on new features. And the Commission clearly says in the CRA that for a while now, vendors need to focus on security. And I think that goes across all of their legislation, that we need to focus on this and lower the cost for society. They also say that, well, we acknowledge that prices for products will go up because we're basically changing the business model for vendors, right? Both with NIS2 and with CRA. But long term, the cost for all of us will go down. And I think that's important to remember when we look at this, that they realize that the vendors are doing the right thing from their point of view. And the only way to change the focus and protect society is legislation.
But I think that's interesting because I think everybody assumes engineers, and we're all engineers really, we know what we should be doing, so we do it. But clearly we're not doing it well enough, and the evidence isn't there. So therefore the regulation comes along to try and sort of, demonstrate your behaviors rather than just saying trust you're doing the right job. Because I think too many times we've just relied on people to do the right thing without telling them what that benchmark is. And that's okay. That's why let's have a debate. But it is, there is, I think everybody knows and then a good engineer knows how to write good code, good systems. But there's plenty of engineers that don't do that if they can get away with doing it because they don't have to.
But this is, I just chime in there.
It's also the process that doesn't really work in many projects I've been involved in as a consultant. That the developers, they know their stuff. They can do secure software, but the priorities are different. So when we do our Scrum meetings and set the priorities, the product manager puts everything about security so far down the list. I had one product manager found out how to delete tickets in the ticket system, so they didn't show up on the proof. So I think when I talked with the developers, because I had to go through security for a product, they knew very well. But the product marketing and management, they prioritized otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was on a podcast yesterday and we talked about security. And to me, security is culture. And culture starts from the top. And essentially, security culture is, and I like to use this litmus test for security culture, which is security culture is what happens when nobody's looking, right? That's what you engineers do when nobody's watching over their shoulders, right? A good testament to good security culture is that they write secure code, follow best practices, and that overhead that you're referring to, Olle, which is very, very true, is just expected. It's expected that you do not cut those corners, and that is the litmus test for good security culture, right?
Yeah, the problem now, we have legislation coming in December 2027, and there's a lot of things that needs to happen, and it's very, very short time, but that's considering the technology path. We have to fix the code, we have to fix the SBOMs, we have to fix security issues, we have to add encryption, all that. But changing how the company people think and prioritize, that will take much more time. And that's going to be the problem with all of this. That
culture is a lot slower than code.
Won't meet.
And if things are not mandated, it doesn't get done because, if you can do shortcuts, people will do shortcuts. We all want to get paid, and if we can get paid quicker for not doing stuff that's not required, we won't do it. And that's for us to have the right behaviour, which ultimately I think is the EU is trying to do with CRA and NIS and DORA, etc. It is trying to make sure people have a consistent behaviour, and we saw that with GDPR 10 years ago. Let's look at personal data. So I think everybody knew what they should be doing, but nobody was quite doing it quite rightly or consistently. So this is probably similar where we are with cyber. We know what we should be doing, we know what the consequences are, but are we doing it correctly? And does everybody understand the consequences of not doing it, which then brings things like accountability, which brings the organizational culture into that? Is, you're going to get some organizations are going to run fast and loose, some are going to be very, very rigorous. How do we get everything aligned?
But if we move back from this CRA, which of course is a favorite topic, and look at there's a whole umbrella, and you mentioned the NIS2 Directive. NIS2 is a directive. CRA is an act. An act is a law in all member countries at the same time. NIS2 has to be implemented in each and every member country, so they can make variants. They're allowed to make variants and change it a little bit. So in Sweden, we got our variant in January 15th this year. We were late, very late. And the problem is, if you're a company that works in multiple, countries, it's hard to say that you're NIS2 compatible because it can be different. Now, the EU is publishing something called the Omnibus, where they will try to change that. So if you're operating in multiple countries, you can operate with an ESA instead of the country level. But they're making it a bit more easy to handle. But NIS2 is interesting because that's for critical services in the society. You have aerospace, universities, and many other sectors, food. Everything that's critical in society needs to have resilience. They need to have cybersecurity, and they need to control the software supply chain. The regulation doesn't say SBOM, but if you read it, it's very clear that you need SBOMs and you need due diligence and you need control of stuff. There is also NIS2 for the IT sector. Everyone that delivers services over a certain size is affected. So if you're a software as a service company only, you will be affected by NIS2 and have to follow that. And the interesting thing with NIS2 is that that law points directly to the management. The management will be responsible. The management has to prove that they've gone through cybersecurity training. And in Sweden, they even added that if there's a problem, you not only get fines, but the CEO can be banned from being a CEO for a number of years within the company register.
Interesting.
So it's very, very personal, the NIS2. CRA isn't.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. So one of the things is CRA, NIS2. Let's do a Venn diagram, right? What's the overlap? If you need to do one, how much do you cover off the other? Because I think that's a lot of the confusion. I mean, even to myself, like it's like it's not a do this and you're done, right? Because you need to wrap your head around a lot of different frameworks that, yeah, there are Venn diagrams. They're not like the same, right? So talk to me about how you guys see that and like path towards compliance, really.
Well, it's kind of interesting. CRA is a product legislation, primarily. Yeah. It is software or hardware with software you sell, something with a digital connection to a network. Doesn't have to be the internet, a network, right? And we already have the radio directive that got a delegated act in August last year that required cybersecurity, and that part will be replaced by the CRA later on. But the CRA also involves remote data processing. So if your product requires some cloud service, that cloud service is affected by the CRA. And if you're large enough, that cloud service is also, I would say, regulated by NIS2. And if you're a bank or insurance company, that cloud service, the backend systems, is regulated by DORA. There is overlaps all around. But many companies, when I've been out talking about this, say, oh, we're a car manufacturer, we're not affected. And I look at my phone and say, I have an app from you because I'm renting car when I travel, so I have many apps. That app is not regulated as a car with 4 wheels and an engine, right? So that app is CRA, and you need to do your homework.
Yeah. I guess my angle was more, if you follow one of these guidelines, you say, let's say hypothetically you are CRA compliant, which is not quite a thing because, again, like BSI got their implementation of CRA, so it's like it's not quite that simple, right? But let's say hypothetically you were to be compliant with whatever that means. How much of that will make you covered by NIS2 or DORA?
I think they're coming from slightly different things because obviously I think DORA is coming from a sector perspective, the financial market. NIS is coming from the criticality of services to society, and CRA is coming from product. So they're all looking at there is a common problem, which is how, cybersecurity is one of the, a horizontal thing that goes across all three.
Yeah.
And organization goes across all of them as well because of who's ensuring them for the governance.
Yeah.
But actually what they're trying to achieve and how they achieve it are very different.
No, but if we sandbox just the cybersecurity component of these compliance frameworks.
NIS is the old kid on the block, right? We had NIS that still haven't really got implementation guidelines for all sectors in Sweden. The legislators the authorities didn't understand it or didn't get resources. I don't know really what the problem was. And it was replaced by NIS2. They're trying to align all of this. On top of it all is an umbrella act and this is getting more and more fun, the Cybersecurity Act, which is updated now. They're updating things to make the puzzle fit better, right?
Right.
And simplify, because NIS2 hit very small companies doing some IT services like DNS hosting, which, I mean, would just be stupid. But the Cybersecurity Act is what authorized ENISA. ENISA got the resources of the cybersecurity from the Cybersecurity Act. It also stipulated the certification for that applies to many of these. If you're in an area that needs a certification, you have a high degree of criticality. But they're updating the Cybersecurity Act as well. And an interesting little directive that runs on the side is the Product Liability Directive. Have you heard about that?
I have not heard about that.
No. They added software. And this is when there's a danger to a person, when something happens, really bad happens to a person, the manufacturer is liable. Software has been excluded, has never been regulated before. And suddenly we get NIS2 CRA and the Product Liability Directive.
So that sort of has a big impact on things like open source, where you get, no warranty, use it as you think, and and as developers, yes, we can only go to so much. We're not,
you never know as a developer of open source where you code and stuff. I mean, I started 20 years ago contributing to an open source telephone branch exchange, a PBX, right? Many carriers took that up. That was the starting point. And businesses, of course, we basically killed a lot of PBX vendors by delivering more functionality for a lower price, zero. Very interesting, bad business idea, delivering open source. But anyway, we did. Later on, I found that this was used in air traffic control.
Oh, wow.
It was used in 112 systems, elevator systems. And if we had liability according to PLD, that would be very dangerous with elevators. So open source is actually excluded, luckily, from this. But if a vendor includes open source, they are liable for the life of people.
So that sort of takes it into sort of the integration role, doesn't it? Yep. And you look at CRA, the manufacturer is the integrator of components, software, hardware, whatever. And I presume the same is true of things like a financial system that's been sold to the bank, that's been integrated by many products.
Yep.
And NIS, again, is, there's an operator of the water system, but actually that's a whole load of systems that are contributing to that water system.
Oh, yeah.
So it's all these sort of things coming together, and who's responsible? It's about responsibility and who's accountable, and how much due diligence do they have to go, and how deep do they go? Do they just go to the first level, so the operator talks to who they've bought the product from, or does he have remit to go all the way down that supply chain? And that, I think, is, going back to Log4j, that's really what I think recognized to me was how deep the software supply chain has become in terms of how obscure it has become. A lot of people didn't know what was being used by whom.
No.
So I think, this is what all these regulations are sort of bringing these to the surface. I don't know whether we have the right way forward. We've got different approaches, like for assessments, self-assessments, etc. But it's actually trying to make sure that people do take some responsibility.
Yeah. How long ago was Log4j?
December the 11th or 9th or something, 2021.
Okay, 2021.
Yeah.
Have we come much further since then? If I operate an IT system, I mean, I usually in my trainings and talks start with I'm lactose intolerant. So when I buy food, I need to have that list of ingredients.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I can cook the same food or bake the same bread, but I need the ingredient list. We need that kind of transparency for products and services. We say, I usually try to joke and say, I'm allergic to curl, CURL, Daniel Stenberg's a really good product, right? So when I buy stuff in my electronics favorite shop, how do I know if there's curl inside? I need to know, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good analogy for SBOMs in general.
Yeah, but we the IT systems out in the industry, in society, they need transparency. We need to prepare for the next Log4j. And we're still far away. But these two actually indirectly points to this. They need to have control over the software supply.
But ultimately, what they're trying to do, and I think for all three of them, trying to pull it together back to your original question from about 5 minutes ago, Victor, is all of them want to assess impact.
Right.
If there is a problem, they want to know who's affected, and then how do I then remediate that quickly, etc. How do I stop the problem? And without that sort of understanding of all those dependencies, you're not going to be able to understand that the full extent of that impact, because otherwise it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. You think you've stopped it and then it pops up somewhere else. So you need to just think about all that impact assessments, and it's classic change management, classic risk management. Ultimately, the fact it's software is interesting for us, but ultimately this is just understanding if something happens, how do I control it?
Yeah. I mean,
but there are interesting hidden things that people. But when you start digging into this, like when you buy a server, that there's a server management software, which is today a full operating system, basically a Linux operating system, running on a server. How much do we know about these?
Oh, very little. I mean, I've had episodes with the core boot guys, for instance, right, who have a wealth of experience.
This is the IPMI software, right?
Yeah, the IPMI is just a separate subset, like even BIOS, which is
but
smaller.
That's connected to the network port. Sometimes it shares network ports with the internet port.
Yeah.
All kinds of hidden things are scary. And especially if you're in the NIS2 world, all the OT, how many times have you gotten a team viewer over an email, unencrypted email, and say, log in here and check, and someone connected a laptop somewhere to an OT system and you need to check something? We need to change culture. We need to change behavior. And NIS2 points to that. Many people are afraid that bugs will be illegal or incidents will be legal. No, it's not about that. It's about your process and your transparency. If shit hits the fan, you're going to talk with your customers and you're going to, in many cases, talk with authorities so they can talk with others. While you fix your stuff, they will help you fix the rest and protect society. But that will take some time to change the culture. And I think that's why it needs to point both to the management, but also in many cases, when you start reading the implementation guide, they point to the organization and roles you must have in your organization.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, these frameworks will live or die by how enforceable they are in the real world. You can draft the best legislation in the world, but let's just go back to GDPR, which is the obvious comparison, right? Like, how much has actually happened there? Like Meta, those guys are stuck in court for another 10, 15 years before we actually get some outcomes from that. If CRA is the same story, then have we actually raised the bar?
I think every little step that CRA changes, I don't believe for a minute that all products with a CE mark by 2027 will be secure. Will follow all the requirements and have a risk analysis, have an SBOM and everything. But every little step is for the better. Every discussion where developers meet product managers and win the security discussion, saying, we need encryption here, we need authentication here, we need to protect the user data, we need secure by default. Every little win is for the better for all of us. But
No, yeah.
since it's about people, I realize this will take more time than we expect.
I think, yeah, I mean, the fines are there as a sort of a, inverted commas, threat, aren't they?
Okay.
To try and say, okay, comply. If you don't comply, then, you know, we'll confine you. And I know certainly the GDPR, you know, small businesses, SMEs that I work with, GDPR is very much front and center of their thought process, because they don't want to be taken to court and fined because that's out of business. Whether larger businesses have a slightly different view, I don't know. Whether CRA will be similar, whether CRA will actually hit the smaller businesses harder than the larger businesses, who knows? It'd be interesting. NIS and DORA's probably, it is only generally large enterprises that are really in scope. I mean, the supply chain might be, but ultimately it's the operators that are going to see it.
Yeah. But the thing with CRA and fines, I think the fines will come if you lie and cheat and you don't follow the authorities. One thing people miss, they look at the fines and they look at, well, if you're a small business, the fine has to be adjusted to fit your business and so on. But the worst weapon the authorities have is actually forbid your distribution of your product. Stop it in all chains. All your distributors, resellers, not allowed to sell a single item. That's going to hurt small businesses really, really bad. The fines, that's an insurance issue, right? Live or die,
Yeah.
but that's someone else. But if your product is forbidden on the market, that's going to be really hard to explain to your stock owners
Yeah.
and
No,
your board.
This is true. This is true. I mean, it's looking at the consumer landscape in Europe today, like where so much of the stuff that you buy on Amazon, or even if you go direct, AliExpress and Alibaba and all these sources, right? Like, you've been lucky if you find an Android device that is not end of life when you buy it from China, right? Most of it is already end of life by the time you buy it. So good luck with CRA on that one. But I guess the reason why I'm raising it is because the change to all these resellers is going to be massive, because so many vendors, I mean, I can speak for myself in the digital signage world with Screenly, right? So many vendors out there just white label shit from China and put some software on it.
Yep.
And
then you're basically a manufacturer in the eyes of them.
Yeah. But I guess this come back, I kind of spoke with Sarah about this as well, but like when you speak into the real world out there, outside of our little bubble in the SBOM world, when you go and ask them about CRA, they'd be like, CRA what?
They have no idea. I met lawyers, I met business people, and they're aware of NIS2 because the large, I would say, legal companies, legal advisors, financial advisors have been talking about that for a year or two. But CRA is totally under the radar.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of percolating from the bigger organizations downwards. And I think, you know, I don't think it's meeting the sort of the small SMEs, 50 to 100 employee type businesses who have probably got quite a little niche market.
Yeah. I think one problem is the fact that we're talking about the CE mark, and the CE mark for the radio directive and hardware has been about electricity and radio leaking and other things. It's a test you do once before you launch a new product, or when you upgrade, you do it once more. But it's a checklist and you're done, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also outsourced fully.
Yeah, and people believe that the CRA and the CE mark is the same, but the CRA points much more to your process. You have to do risk analysis and you have to do mitigations. There's no checklist. According that fulfills your risk analysis and your threat model. And then you have to maintain the product during the whole lifetime. And you can't define the lifetime all by yourself. The market authorities will have a say in that. So if you're in a market where you sold products that exist out there in the OT system for 15 years, you can't say 3 years. You have to have at least 10 or 15 years of free software upgrades and security maintenance for that.
So do you think the CRA, some of the things that the CRA is pushing, because the CRA is the latest thing on the, the newest idea, do you think some of the stuff will actually have an impact on things like NIS2 and DORA to try and bring some of the things together? Because if you're an organization who is serving in multiple markets, really you want to have something that's common. And one of the challenges I see is software and digital is generally a global thing rather than just an EU issue or a US or UK issue. So really what we want single, I have to say benchmark, but choose that as a starting word, which we all have to achieve and demonstrate. So do you think we'll get to there, or do you think we're, is that 10 years off?
There's only two things in that question. One, NIS2 points specifically to CRA. The purchases, even before CRA is active, NIS2 points to CRA and CRA compatibility. And they also changed a law for medical journal systems, I believe, to point to CRA after the CRA was published. So they already changed the CRA a little bit. So they're going to use CRA for products in other regulations, I
Interesting.
think. Now I've forgotten about the second part.
So the question is more about the global impact.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of,
that part. That's interesting, in fact, that the CRA, you know that they're working on horizontal and vertical standards. Horizontal are for all products. Vertical are for special product niches, especially those that are in the classes the CRA talk about as important or critical products. But many people who earn money from these standards, because you have to buy them, like standards, claim that you have to certify according to these. That's not the case. You can certify, you self-certify 99% of the products, and you can certify according to the CRA law text. But the law also says that there will be agreements, bilateral agreements. So if you're certified according to a law that is compatible with the CRA requirement-wise, you'll be also certified for the CRA. And there was a meeting a few years ago between EU and a US, I believe maybe it was CISA. I don't think that discussion have continued because CISA have lost so much employees. They don't have time for that. But the US government worked with something called the Cyber Trust Mark for IoT. And I believe they try to align the processes a bit. So I think the vision was if you had the Cyber Trust Mark, you would also have the CE mark.
But it was, that was one of the big EU talking points coming out of Davos this year, was around making the European market more compatible, for lack of a better word, where it is extremely fragmented today. Like if you work on the German market and you're trying to work with like Northern Europe, like it's a completely different framework to operate. So that was both from a financial perspective, but also from like a legal framework perspective, right? So there are some talking heads at the top that is trying to at least drive that narrative.
Yeah, that's why they're changing a little bit on these too. They're taking things back. I think they've seen that each country is making changes that makes it really hard to work cross-border.
Yeah.
They're going to take in the omnibus now, they're going to take things back. So NIS2 will be more of the same and very small variants.
Yeah.
But that's going to take some time. If it took us multiple years to get NIS2 into the Switch law.
Yeah. And then if you look at countries outside the EU, UK, yes, there's no equivalent to the CRA other than the CRA in Europe. It doesn't exist in the other 200 countries. How many countries we've got in this world these days? So if you are a manufacturer who wants to sell globally, are you then is CRA providing a huge additional overhead on selling to the US, selling to Asia or wherever? What we need to really think about is, is a CRA the best everybody should adapt to, or is it the one that people will make a decision? I don't want to go to Europe because it's too onerous, it's too legislatively hard, so I'll go outside Europe, and the European community has less options.
I mean, we used to have a polarized world even before CRA, right? So if you look at security compliance, companies selling into the US market, they tend to do SOC 2. People selling into the European market, they do ISO 27001, right? Companies that play on both sides tend to do both, right? But CRA then does that become the North Star? That's kind of supersedes, because honestly, like, I call bullshit a lot of the ISO SOC 2 stuff because it's just paperworking nonsense. But I'm curious about how CRA fits.
It's a bit like GDPR, isn't it? You've got the GDPR, which has sort of become things, but I know the US has got different similar things, haven't it? The states have different things.
California got their
California
own
has got its own way, hasn't it?
Stuff, right?
Yeah.
Calm down, guys. Europe is in the lead here. Hello.
Yeah.
Right. Writing laws. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But jokingly aside, I have a friend who works worldwide with this kind of certification, and he makes it very clear. If you want to avoid being regulated when you sell products, there's not many countries you can go to. Even China is working on regulation. Not exactly the same, but regulation for cybersecurity and products you sell. So there are very few places you can escape to. Maybe CRA is going far because other countries start with IoT or other vertical sectors. The medical industry has been regulated for a long time, even in Europe. Automotive has been regulated for a long time. But we believe when they started talking about the CRA that they were going to regulate IoT, then they expanded, and suddenly they regulated mobile apps and everything, toys, other things. So,
it's an interesting narrative though, because like you look at countries like South Korea is extremely progressive when it comes to like SBOM work, for instance, right?
Yeah.
But are we ending up with a very, very fragmented world now, where it becomes like almost impossible to operate in all this many markets because everyone has their own implementation and nuances to this stuff? Like, I'd say, love it or hate SOC 2 and ISO, at least it's a global standard, right?
I think we've got to be careful about, and I've been a great one for standards, because I think standards are great for interoperability and great, for market access. But I'm not. I want things that are freely available as well.
Yeah.
That are also that everybody sees. So there's a little bit of a if standards go behind paywalls, then the adoption, I think, becomes a tariff ultimately, and people will try and short circuit it. And we look at things like the RFCs and the web. All those standards are freely available, and I think we've seen the great success that how standards come together because people collaborate and make them better.
But friends, you have to understand it. I mean, I really admire the business idea of Sense-Elec and the standard bodies. You pay to get in, you contribute with your time with it, getting paid, but you're not even getting the documents you're writing for free. They don't have to pay to get the document. You get paid in both ends. It's a brilliant business idea, but it doesn't really help the world.
No.
IETF publish open standards, ECMA International, the CycloneDX specification, the Pearl, the CLE, all freely available. And I believe that helps implementations from very, very small companies, open source project, up to large corporations. I think that's really important, and I think the other business idea will hopefully go away.
But one thing,
unless I steal that idea and start a new Johansson Standard Institute here.
No, but one thing that's important to talk about when you talk about compliance standards is really the concept of self-certification versus a certification body that in turn outsources their work to some kind of compliance organization, right? CRA is a self-certified standard. at the
Mostly.
top level.
Mostly.
Yeah. But there are other standards that are similar, whereas this is not true for ISO or SOC 2, for instance. It's not, you cannot self-certify and say, hi, I'm compliant. You can do it SOC 2 type 1, I think, is self-certified. Type 2 is not, if I got my lingo right. But Anthony, you kind of brought the UK into the equation, but let's take the turns a little bit and turn into the UK market. It is a bit of an oddball because it is Europe, but not Europe. So let's unpack the...
Good thing that you said it, Victor. I would be a very bad spot if I said something like that.
I'm dialing in from the UK, so like, I can take the battle. But my point is, there's been a lot of stuff worked, like GCHQ and so on. They've been put out a lot of stuff and good documentation, good recommendations around secure by default, secure by design. But it doesn't quite have any teeth. Let's pick up on that. Like, where's your head at that?
So, how long have we got? I think you're right that basically the UK works very globally with the US, etc. And we all the problems the UK has and France and US has in terms of cybersecurity. Yeah, we all suffer, and they are doing things to protect the nations safe and secure. Fine. Where I have an issue with things like the CRA, which is now the CRA has now gone down to digital products, consumer devices, quite small devices, your baby monitors, your light bulbs. We don't have anything equivalent in the UK. Now, the UK issued last year the Software Security Code of Practice.
Yeah.
And they claim it aligns with the CRA. And it comes out with 14 principles. And it says you need to have knowledge of your supply chain, you need to do, get governance control, etc., understand vulnerability management, etc. But it's voluntary. There is no compulsion for anybody to demonstrate they are compliant with that. And I was involved in the, when it came out in draft, and we gave them comments about, because they called it the Software Code of Practice and it was aimed at software, what they call software vendors. I said it's going to miss the target audience, because the target audience means the people who are using software, not just a software vendor like a Microsoft, just use a vendor, as just creating a software product. It's the integrated product was missing out.
Yes.
So I've raised it. I said that if it's voluntary, you will not get the behavior changes that you require to deliver secure projects. And this is exactly the same way the US went with the medical device market, in terms of they promoting secure by design, exactly the same way the UK has, but the manufacturers were not complying until the regulation came along, and then they got the required evidence. So when I've been talking to people about secure by design, there's some companies starting to think about secure by design, but there's no benchmark. And it's not a case of, well, do you go to a consultant to say, do I get a tick in the box? Nobody knows what good looks like yet. And that's the challenge I think we have. We know what we should be doing, but there's no exam to pass yet. And people love a checklist, ultimately. And I don't like checklists because it's evidence-based, but people want that checklist so they can stick in the box and say, I am now, CRA UK compliant. And that's what people tend to look for. It's the easy A. So I wish the UK would align with with what's happening globally. But I know there are challenges. There are challenges getting the industry aligned, and I think the big challenge probably is the public sector, getting the public sector to align with the requirements of such things like that, because it's really difficult to get them to move.
That's the big irony. I forgot which piece of legislation it was. I think it was Sweden, or was it somewhere else? But they basically put that our mandate that everybody needs to do secure by design, except the government. It's just like, wait, shouldn't you lead by example?
And I personally, I agree, Victor, is that when I've presented SBOMs and things like that, and I said, we need somebody like the government to take the example, and then in the same way that US has done is people contracting to the Fed, they get it, then it becomes part of the the ecosystem, because
Yeah.
the government is the biggest customer of anything.
I mean, just to use kind of an analogy here, like UI UX, for instance. I mean, for those not in the UK are probably not familiar with this, but the UK government got a UI UX guideline that every single UK government portal must adhere to. So they have like a design UI UX kit that every single UK government service follows, which I think is actually great. Like you might like or dislike the UI UX, it doesn't really matter, but it is thought through and it follows best practices for most things. We kind of need the same thing for cybersecurity. Now,
No. And one of the things I was involved, there was a survey, and they were asking, do I use software that's come from outside the UK? Well,
what does that even mean?
what does that mean? That's a good question. But and the analogy I was saying when I had a chat with somebody said, if I write my software in my laptop in Manchester, and then I take my laptop and write it that when I go to Paris, am I now writing software in Paris, and am I using software that's now come from the outside the UK? It doesn't make sense because But why is even that a question they were thinking that's relevant?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've had a lot of those conversations when I was involved with CISA, a lot of the working groups. One of the talking points around that is around who wrote the code, right? This is kind of attribution and SBOMs, right? Like, what's the GitHub handle?
It doesn't matter where they're writing, it's who's writes it, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but
also,
how do you do attribution? Like, it's almost impossible.
But shall we take another? I mean, if you look at NIS2 and CRA and everything, it's and secure by design. One trend that was discussed heavily a year ago or more was shift security left.
Yeah.
The question is, who do we shift left? Because they don't exist in most organizations. And we also had a discussion at my conference last time about legal needs to be in there as well, because with risk assessments, that is part both of all these regulations. Legal needs to be involved in the risk assessment because that's a legal decision, they claim. So we need to shift legal left. And the problem with that is that the legal department is very used to say no and not come up with solutions and say yes. And the same goes for security. You developed a service, software as a service or something, you develop a product, and in the last minute before launch, you have a security review, you have a pen test, and you have security people that act as police saying yes or no. And if they say no, you will get additional cost and you have to go back and rebuild. But they're not part of that process. You come back after a while to another toll gate where they stand and check your product from their big shares. This is a culture change for a lot of people. And the question is, where are those people? Companies today doesn't pay for training. Companies we're in a financial climate where we can't employ a lot of new people. So how can we do this? There's a big change both in the NIS2 sectors and all producers of products in the CRA.
For the producer software, I think, as much as I hate to use the phrase, but I think AI is actually the savior here. Because the reality is that modern models we have today, like look at Opus, they will write better and more secure code than the average developer. I would argue that Opus 4.6 probably writes better code than 98% of the developers out there, right? Okay. And more secure. So I guess what I'm saying is, in one way, it's easier than ever to write more secure code. Then, in that way it is. And also auditing that code is easier than it ever was, right? Because now you can have an LLM that's trained on security dimensions, and it can do a full audit on your code base in minutes or hours, right?
Someone needs to understand that audit.
Oh, 100%. But that's why the role of the engineer is changing to becoming an architect from a code monkey, right?
But
that is a huge shift.
That architect needs to know secure by design.
Yes.
The mechanisms. And at the same time as we do all this and have this mountain of stuff to do for NIS2 and for CRA compliance, we have the post-quantum crypto thing coming. And
Yeah.
we haven't seen all that regulation, but that will happen during the coming 5 to 10 years during your product's life cycle.
But I want to
And
steer
this
it
is
back.
interesting because that means we need to have crypto agility. We need to be able to change for products that exist out there. In runtime, we need to change the whole crypto engine. We need to switch trust anchors.
Yeah.
And most companies haven't even thought of doing that. They're running PKIs with, we have 30-year certificates, so we never have to bother, at least not before I retire.
Low crypto RSA stuff. And but I want to steer it back to open source again, because I think it's really important. Because I want to throw
You're
this.
avoiding PQC. I got you there.
I would love to. I would love to talk PKI, but I think it's been out of scope for the conversation. We can do another episode of PKI, because I would love to talk PKI with you, because I that's actually something I really enjoy. But I want to steer this back to open source for a simple reason, because we kind of started talking about the liability of open source in vendors, and if we overlap that with the fact that these LLMs can write code very, very quickly. So I saw a really interesting thought experiment the other day, and someone was saying, because these LLMs are so good these days, and if we assume the rate of change is at the pace it has been for the last 6-12 months, and they just can get better and better. The argument someone was making, I forgot the credit to this, but it was basically like, it makes it irrelevant for using open source in commercial products, because it's more of a liability, for the simple reason that if you're using open source, then you need to do completely different supply chain management, versus if your LLM is writing all that boilerplate code himself, it changes the dimensions for security.
But what you're doing is, I can see why someone would say that, but what you've got is, you've got first party code, but you've got all of the code is first party code. Yeah. If you have some code that's open source, you've actually got a bigger development team, because the open source community is looking after that bit of code for you as well. So do you want to do, and I can see both sides. If you want to be completely in control, do the LLM, which is much the same way people like inner source, where they may take all the open source and control it themselves, and then periodically bring stuff from the outside. Or do you use the open source community for what it's great at, unpaid, often no commitment, but some awesome development work and some awesome features, who are actually far more responsive than maybe you can, because you've got 1,000 development teams in parallel rather than one development team.
This is not me shitting open source. I think it's fantastic. I'm just saying the argument that this person was making was basically like, when you're pulling in an open source library, you're going to use 1% of that code base.
Yeah, I can see that, yes.
And the probability of vulnerability in that 1% of that code base is relatively small compared to you pulling an entire library.
So what I've been looking at is, and this is sort of from some of the ideas that have been played around with FOSDEM, is I think SBOMs, we need to go even lower than we currently do, because we're at the component level, which it says, I've got a library and I've got 100 functions. I'm not documenting which of those 100 functions I'm using. Yes. Now I've been looking at doing that for binaries, and I've got somewhere with that. Well, it would be good to start getting that increased level of granularity, such that allows you to say, well, if I am affected, am I really affected? Because actually the SBOM or the transparency is going down to that level of detail.
Without vex.
And we don't have that, and we don't have that with anything at the moment.
Yeah, that's typical us, because we worked for quite some time now with SBOMs, and we're looking at the next step, while most of the people haven't really begun the first step, right? But I do agree we need to go to a component level at some time, but that's going to cost a lot more time and money. But Viktor, coming back to your way of thinking there, I'm an old network guy. I built networks with this pipe. I trained people in Ethernet and IP and LDAP and all that. I worked for 10 years with the SIP protocol. So I'm a protocol geek. And what we see today in the world of networking is that most people take it as assumed that it's working, and the knowledge is disappearing from organizations.
Yes.
So even basic misconfiguration and problems can't be solved because there's no one home. What if your scenario with coding happens and we got a problem that the LLM can solve for you? We need someone that goes in and analyzes the code and fixes the problem, or finds it and helps the LLM find the problem.
Well, I mean,
That person won't be there.
you're right. You're right. However,
and that's
if we were to extract,
serious cost and problem.
100%. I just, the future scenario that I envision in 5, 10, 15 years from now is these LLMs will write code that no human can understand. They might help. They might even write assembly straight up, right? And
they don't need the abstraction layer we need.
Exactly. So maybe that argument is kind of moot because the pool of people on the planet today that can do assembly that well is very small.
But that comes, I've worked in sort of what you'll call critical infrastructures, and where safety and security, and we can argue safety and security where they are. I want determinism, I want stability, I want guarantees. You thought something into an LLM, you've no guarantee you're going to get the same thing the next day.
No,
if you use a coder, a developer, a person with experience, you're going to get roughly the same. Okay, they'll learn and they may get better, but you're going to see some relationship. So I think we've got to be really careful about assuming everything doesn't need the human involvement. In particular, these regulations need the evidence. And if you can ask the developer why he made a decision, and I've got a student working for me, and we're trying to emphasize the importance of writing those assumptions that you made implicitly, writing those down, someone can pick them up 6 months later. LMLs doesn't do that. And if we need to do that, when we can understand when an issue happens in a product, and we can say, well, we made that design decision not to encrypt that data flow because it's a design decision, but it's captured. At least you've got some evidence to start with of why you got the consequences of not doing that.
No, we are going that direction. I mean, look at the way 15 years ago when we created a system, we had this Linux guy that installed all the things. He was magical, and he installed everything and then installed the application, got it running. Nowadays, we have a lot of systems as code. We have Terraforms, we have Docker files, we set up stuff, but we seldom log into all of these, right? We don't sit with Chop or anything. We monitor them with observability.
At the end of the day, right?
And what you're saying is we're going to take the next step and say the input to the LMs is the code. That's what we're going to manage and control. But the code, well, we won't even understand it, and we don't have to. But I guess we need much better test systems then.
Well, but
the whole paradigm is changing, but it's always been changing.
Yeah, but I mean, this is what some of the smartest people in the AI world is working right now. It's the guardrails around that, right? Yeah. How do you put up guardrails and without losing velocity?
But picking up the word testing, isn't that bringing everything back? The reason they want the regulation is because people are releasing products that haven't been tested adequately.
Well,
and that's
subjective. Testing is subjective.
Yeah, and and we all know we can always testing is always time bound. And actually, okay, AI could help do that, but ultimately, how do you know you have tested every possibility? Because if once you've tested every possibility, then your product will never be on the market.
You know who's really going to test every possibility? Machines are really good at testing every possible possibility.
But hackers will. How far do you do that? Yeah.
The testing has focused on the functionality the customer requires, the blinking lamps and all the cool stuff. But they totally ignore the security aspects. They haven't looked for security holes. They haven't.
Yeah.
I mean, they ignore the vast amounts of cybersecurity knowledge that's been out there. for business reasons, and I understand that. If you operated a business with maximum profit as the goal, there was no reason, because customers bought your shit. There's no reason to invest in cybersecurity. And by the way, the cybersecurity experts, they're weird people. You don't want to hang out with them, right? So
No, but this is the way.
we'll go back to where we started. Legislation is needed to fix this.
Yeah,
But
100%.
it's going to be a culture change, and legislation won't fix the culture and how people act and think.
But people have got to think, and this is where secure by design can come in as well, because a lot of people focus on the functionality, as you say, the use cases. When I train people, I say, you need to think differently, not like an engineer sometimes, and you have to think about the abuse cases.
Yeah.
And that's that suddenly things, well, what's an abuse case? Well, it's not written down. Well, that's the hacker hasn't got a playbook of how to hack your product. He's got some playbook things that common failures, but he's not going to, he'll find things that are not written down. So therefore, how do you ensure that? And that's the things that's where the testing is. Maybe, you can automate a lot of it, but maybe you do need to have a different thinking. And, how much testing do you do? There's a, I mean, how much training do you need to do for a marathon? Well, you've got time. Yes, you've got to be pragmatic sometimes.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, training a data set on, say, what's top 100 is relatively trivial, and running that against a code base is relatively trivial. That's more than most companies out there are doing today, right? And that's why I'm bullish on agents to do security audits, because they can be very, very specific, and they are read up on the latest vulnerabilities and whatnot, and have that data set, whereas an old school security guy might go to like 2 conferences a year and pick up on new stuff. Whereas, so like, it's a moving target, right?
Yeah.
But let's steer this back to CRA, which ultimately steers us to SBOMs, because I think that's the common thread between all of us. One of my
back to home turf, Viktor.
Back to home turf, indeed. But one thing that worries me a little bit around the SBOM requirements in CRA is that people treat it as a checkbox exercise, and they will just submit something. And as we all know, garbage in, garbage out, right? Because if there's no audit of that, how do we or even let me ask a question, like, how do we even prevent that from happening?
First, there's no obligation to submit anything until, if you're certified, there may be other rules, right? But if you're self-certified, until the market authority asks you. But there's also a clause saying that the market authorities may ask you to collect statistics from the SBOMs. But I think that there's a mistake when they wrote here. They specified clearly that the SBOM the authorities will ask for, which is at least top-level dependencies, because they can find out the rest if they have the top levels, right? And they're well-known, unless they're internal. So you have Viktor 1, Viktor 2, Viktor 3 as top-level dependencies. No one knows what that is. You probably need to go one layer down there. But the rest of the text indicates clearly that the vendor is responsible for everything he sells, all the components, and he needs to have due diligence. He needs to have vulnerability checks. He needs to do pen testing. So in order to comply with that, you need a database of all your components. And you probably also want the licenses and the copyrights and the package URLs for checking it. And you end up with a full SBOM, not a top-level dependency, right? You can call it whatever you want, Excel spreadsheet or database, but it is a software bill of materials. So the law could have been more clear that, the thing you deliver to market authorities is one, but in order to fulfill the process here, you certainly need a full SBOM.
But going back to what you said, how do you know whether it's complete? Or how do you know whether it's right? And I think this is one of the big challenges we have as an SBOM community, is we have no consistency. So if you run one tool and you've got 5 dependencies, direct or indirect, doesn't matter, and you have another tool that tells you 10, how do you know which is right? because if you only take the 5 and you only monitor those 5 components, you can still have a vulnerability that could be exploited in a component you don't know about.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you will still be affected by the CRA because you have a requirement to not deliver a product without exploitable vulnerabilities, whatever that might mean. So we have a quality problem in terms of how do you ensure the things. So I strongly recommend to people that they should never just use one tool. They should use multiple tools and often try and aggregate those and try and say, well, if they are significantly different, well, maybe get a third tool to try and arbitrate. But if they are radically different, that's a danger. And the danger I see is people were going to select one tool and assume that's the right thing to do. And I've never been of that view. When I used to compile code in C, I would always have 2 or 3 compilers and compile them and prove it worked.
Well, we're also talking different states here. The tool, I fully agree with Anthony here. I've been in projects where management bought a fancy, cool tool from a company, and it didn't work for our code base at all. But people believe that, well, we run it, we comply with the management, and we're happy. But they didn't have any SBOM. I think that's critical. But if you go back to CRA, you need SBOMs for your development work. That's fine. But the product you deliver may be something else. There may be an installer. There may be hardware, firmware, like we discussed IPMI earlier, and other things. The market authority will want SBOMs of the product, not your code only, the product you're placing on the market.
Yeah.
And I think that's the critical difference that people are quite often missing. That the product you're placing on the market can contain a lot of different things.
Let me tell you firsthand, if you're a PC manufacturer today or an OEM selling PCs to the European market, you're not going to find a vendor out there, to my knowledge, that can provide you SBOM of every single firmware. They do not exist. I've looked. I am not aware of any that can provide you SBOM, except to some extreme niche players, perhaps.
But also check the agreements when you buy a board and you get firmware and you get drivers and other things. The agreements may be problematic if you want to reveal what's in there. And as you said, they're not ready to provide you with SBOMs, which means you may have to change board manufacturer. And that means you have less than 1.5 years to do that and rewrite your code for that.
Yeah.
And I think, if people aren't, if some manufacturers aren't prepared to deliver an SBOM, then does the onus then become on the manufacturer to create an SBOM?
Well, good luck doing that with AMI bias or something like that, right?
Correct. So therefore, that's a challenge that people are going to have to do, and it won't be. Do we want everybody to be doing that? So, choose your BIOS, and the BIOS is in hundreds of products. Does that mean you want hundreds of people trying to do the same job or not? Where does that go?
We're now in a very technical, exact world, which is good for engineers. We feel safe and comfortable. But we also have to realize the market authorities doesn't have the knowledge. They're staffing up. In Sweden, we haven't even made decision about which market authorities. We have a proposal. So they haven't got the directives, they haven't got the funding, they haven't got the staff. So this will be a market problem that, as Anthony indicated, will apply to many different companies. And I think it's an issue we have to take later. We have to start with baby steps and move ourselves upward the stack. But it's going to be a problem at some point, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, piggybacking on that narrative, like when I had Sarah on the show, we talked about, because she was on a tech committee for CRA, right? So she has a lot of insight into the reasoning of why things are written the way they are. Yeah. But she was basically saying, to your point, Olle, it's about showing effort. That's the thing. Like, and kind of like what I was, my talk at FOSDEM was essentially about how you generate SBOM that's CRA compliant. And it's about showing effort that you're moving in the direction.
You won't get fines if the market authority finds a component you haven't got in your SBOM. But if you ignore them and don't update your SBOM, then you will be in trouble. So it's a lot about cooperation and, as you say, process. CRA is more about process than checklists. And people know them.
And I've always said,
models, which is the critical issue. It doesn't point to management, but it will end up in management because it's going to change the business model. The cost of maintaining a product will be much higher than before, and many companies doesn't have a revenue to match that cost.
I've always said, when I got started getting looking at open source licensing, ignorance is no defense. And I said, when I tell the engineers, this is what the challenges are, basically, at least take it seriously and try and do the best you can. You're not going to be perfect, but at least you'll have made an effort to try and capitalize, to look at, has that application got a license, a valid license or not against your policy. And I think the CRA is going to start with that at the time. And exactly as you're saying, Sarah would say, let's demonstrate commitment. We're committed to try and do that. We're never going to be perfect because perfect no one's defined what perfect exists. And then when we start looking at all the different standards around the world in terms of, what should we include in our SBOM, that will evolve over time. But I don't want us to get fixated on, is it JSON, is it XML, is it CycloneDX or SBDX? I just want to make sure, have we got that inventory of information that we can then start doing things to actually make society more secure and more resilient. Ultimately, that's the goal we want to get to.
I'd love to have a 1 hour discussion about XML or ABCD or JSON.
Well, the long and short is that if you hate yourself, go for XML. If you don't hate yourself, go for JSON.
Yes.
And we're not even talking about XML schemas. But anyway, I think Anthony's point is important here. It's about making society more secure.
Yes.
It's not about making society secure. It's the process that ultimately is critical
comes
here.
down to one thing, right? It's when we're looking at, again, kind of throwing back to my FOSDEM talk, is basically people want an easy button. That's the vast majority of the people that needs to adhere to CRA. They do not care of between Cyclone, SBDX, Cyclone versions, SBDX versions, build, run, all these like nuances that we kind of like in this little bubble spend the days talking about. The vast majority of customers who needs to be, or vendors that need to be compliant, they couldn't care less. They want that easy button. Decide, do I have an SBOM? Yes. Cool. Move on.
Not having an SBOM is the problem. I want people to start saying, when you ask for an SBOM, and that's what my FOSDEM talk, which one do you want? I want people to be actually asking those sort of questions. What flavor would you like? Yes.
But that's step 2, right? That's not step 1. That's step 2.
Well, yes. And I think we're probably, as you say, because we're in this bubble, we're already 2 steps ahead.
The world is a step -2. We are at step 5, right? So let's get to 0 first, right?
I think zero is achieved because I think people have been talking about SBOMs for 5 years, and there is now some experience.
Let's be real, Anthony. We have been talking about SBOMs for 5+ years. That is not the rest of the world. Where you speak to a lot of people, even in the tech world, they don't even know what SBOMs are. So let's bring it in a little bit.
Okay, obviously I've got the wrong nerdy friends then.
Anthony and I in SBOM Europe, we wrote something. Was it a year ago? Called the
Zen SBOM. Yeah.
And I think that's important to go back to now and then. And I think one of the most important one is of the 10 rules there is any SBOM is better than no SBOM.
Yes.
Yes.
Then we can discuss the next step and the next step. But get an SBOM, get it working, and try to take your first steps, and then we can make better.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic note to end at. Thank you both for coming on the show. We are at time. Are there any last words? Olle, I know you have a conference coming up. You want to do a shout out to that about that before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Anthony and I, as I said, we've been running SBOM Europe for a while now. We've been participating in conferences and other things, but we try to not put things up a notch now by starting our own conference called SBOM Focus, because we haven't found that on this side of the Atlantic. And with all the legislations we've been talking about, I think it's time for the SBOM nerds to meet and work on the steps forward. So SBOM Focus is April 10th, Friday, April 10th in Stockholm, Sweden. We are planning to move this around Europe and also discussing how to create labs, much like the SBOMarama labs in the US, to test interoperability, to help the community and the industry to get tools that work together, because this is going to be a tool chain, not a single tool. And we need them to work together. And in addition to that, in the labs, we're going to introduce labs and interoperability tests for the Transparency Exchange API, which will be very important. And that goes hand in hand with CycloneDX 2.0. So we have a lot of cool stuff, but it all starts in Stockholm, April 10th. Go to sbomfocus.eu and you'll find more information. And we'll see you in Stockholm in the spring. Much better than today.
Good stuff. Perfect. Thank you both for coming on the show. A lot of fun. I really appreciate it. And I will see you both at some SBOM event around the world sometime soon. But until then, have a good one. Thank you so much, guys.
Have a good one.
Take care.
For today.
Thank you.
Bye.